going to start with the official intro. It's happening. Thank you all for being here. There is a show captions button on your Zoom toolbar, if that is a feature that will be useful for you. My name is Lauren. I am a survivor, a credentialed victim advocate, trauma support specialist, and community builder. I am the voice and founder of MTMV Community Support Network. MTMV is one of the first social media-based communities for survivors and their supporters. We offer peer support, groups, workshops, consulting, events, and resources for individuals affected by trauma, abuse, and sexual violence across the globe. MTMV also connects individuals with resources aimed at enhancing mental health and overall well-being. Reminder, this virtual Zoom panel is a fundraiser. All proceeds will go directly to Dawn. Dawn's mission is to promote healthy relationships and reduce abuse in the deaf community in the Washington, D.C. area. Please donate if you can at tinyurl.com. Donate to Dawn, and I will put that in the chat as well. Special shout out to tinyurl for making all these events so much easier to have a accessible URL. I divert. Before we dive in, let's take a moment to acknowledge and review the agreements for the space. As we're joining from different places, it can be helpful to come together with set expectations. Everyone in this space is equally responsible in maintaining a welcoming environment. It's respectful, encouraging, and supportive to all its members. Cheyenne, thank you for putting them in the chat. Let us know if you have any questions or concerns. Safety is the priority. Okay, so before we begin the panel discussion, I would love to introduce our esteemed panelists, and then I'm going to pass it over to Sarah Seltzer from Dawn to share a little bit more about the work that Dawn is doing. Also, special thank you to our interpreters, Mona and Shelby. Thank you. And don't worry, it's not going to be me talking the whole time. I'm just going to get some introductions done. In alphabetical order, we have Kat Tenbarge. Kat Tenbarge is an award-winning feminist journalist who writes the newsletter Spitfire News. Her work has been published in Wired, NBC News, Business Insider, and more. She has reported on several high-profile cases of gender-based violence against influencers and celebrities. Next up, we have Kat Marsh, who's a career prosecutor. For the majority of her career, she specialized in the child abuse, child exploitation, domestic violence, and sexual assault cases. In addition, she works as a professional trainer for prosecutors, staff, law enforcement, educational institutions, community organizations, state organizations, and other legal professionals. She has worked on drafting legislation to help hold abusers accountable and has been called to testify on behalf of criminal legislation before the Maryland legislature for a number of years. Next up, we have Lakedra Houston. Lakedra Houston is an award-winning social justice leader, U.S. Air Force veteran, and founder of KeyFit LLC, dedicated to mobilizing marginalized communities, uplifting their voices, and driving grassroots efforts for policy change at state and federal levels. With degrees in criminal justice and leadership and a forthcoming master's in social work specializing in military and trauma, Lakedra is a certified expert in ASSIST, victim advocacy, and resiliency training. She brings over a decade of experience addressing domestic violence, sexual assault prevention, mental health advocacy, and providing employment and resources for unhoused veterans. Next up, we have Morgan Chandler. Morgan is the managing partner of Hammerco Lawyers, a Vancouver, BC-based law firm in Canada. She works exclusively for survivors, bringing forth civil sexual assault claims, and is a powerful advocate for her clients against both individual and institutional defendants while prioritizing the needs and interests of her clients. Morgan advocates for trauma-informed education with the legal system and is the president of SALA, the Sexual Abuse Lawyers Alliance, an organization dedicated to education and advocacy within the civil sexual assault space. Our last panelist is Sarah Seltzer, they, a Brooklyn native. She brings over 4 years of nonprofit experience, specializing in disability justice, advocacy, and program development. She serves as the program and operations manager at DAWN, Deaf Abused Women's Network, where she supports program coordination, provides advocacy services for survivors, manages internal operations, and assists executive leadership. At DAWN, her work centers on advancing equity and access for survivors of domestic and sexual violence with the deaf, deafblind, deaf disabled, late deafened, and hard of hearing communities. So welcome to our panelists. Panelists, when you get a moment, go ahead and drop in the chat where they can find you on social media, etc., so we can see more about the amazing work you're doing. I am going to quit yakking for a moment and pass it over to Sarah from DAWN to chat and tell a little bit more about the amazing work DAWN is doing. Welcome, Sarah.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sarah. This is my sign name. It's S on the chest. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. I just want to share a bit about DAWN. I know that you've touched on it, and I'd like to share about their mission and what they're doing. DAWN was founded in 1999 by 5 deaf women who recognized that there was a need for an establishment for both sexual violence and domestic violence in the DC and Maryland area, where there can be resources for the deaf community because this access was not available. Oftentimes, we have hearing entities that do have these resources. So this was established in 1999, and we became an official organization in 2003. And now we're approaching on our 25th anniversary coming this fall in October. So we're working on Boots. It's breaking out of the silence. It's an auction that we'll be hosting, and it's to recognize the establishment of DAWN and really to honor those women who provided services for the deaf, deaf and hard of hearing, deafblind, deafly in the DC and Maryland area. We provide services in many facets, such as case management, where we do wrap around services. So if there's any other services in regards to any other specific situation, or we work with other organizations, we provide peer advocacy. We have supportive groups. We provide education, different resources and information. We provide reference or referrals to lawyers, attorneys, any outreach. If there's any additional support that's needed, we provide those information. We are a small organization, yet mighty. I'm one of 5. And also, I just want to throw that DAWN is one of the only organization that's deaf by deaf throughout the United States. There's a total of 22 organizations throughout the United States, and DAWN happens to be one of them. And our focus is primarily in DC and Maryland, and that's basically what we do. And also, I'd like to add one more thing. Here at DAWN, we provide services for a variety of things, for any people, any gender, any of those that may or may not have experience with domestic violence or sexual violence, and we provide lodging anybody who experiences abuse, violence, or harm. And that's it.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the important work that you are doing. It is so critical, and especially as I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but as funding for these important issues and these important critical, life-saving services are continuing to be slashed. Support DAWN, support, nonprofit organizations. I put the link in the chat in case folks wanted to donate. We're able to, tinyurl.com slash thing, donate to Dawn. So thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, now that we got some of the intros, etc. out, let's take a moment, shake it out. Okay, let's dive in. We believe it is important for survivors, professionals, and our communities at large to engage in a conversation about documentation, why it might be helpful, safety planning, challenges, and how we can better support survivors in relation to record keeping and documentation. So let's talk about it. For this first question, panelists, I am going to go in alphabetical order. And so starting off with Kat 10 bars, the first question is, in your purview, what do the words survivor documentation or survivor evidence mean to you? What comes to mind? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you everyone for being here. So as a reporter, survivor evidence and survivor documentation to me typically refers to information and then media. So what I mean by that is when I come into contact with survivors, frequently they'll either be reaching out to me, or if they've shared their stories or their stories have been publicized otherwise, I'll then be reaching out to them sometimes. And our interactions usually begin with an off the record conversation where we can establish sort of the terms moving forward, whether they're comfortable doing an on the record interview. We talk about things like anonymity. And in those early conversations, the information gathering process has already begun. But as we go throughout the reporting process, one of the big parts of my job is ensuring what information the survivor is okay with sharing publicly, and also determining what is the best information to share. And so we'll also talk about this a little bit more later on. But in looking at what these words mean, things like doing an on the record interview or an interview on background, when the survivor shares their testimony, to me, that is a form of evidence, and it's also a form of documentation. And oftentimes those interviews will be sort of like storytelling, where a survivor will share with me at whatever degree they're comfortable with, this is the story that I'm coming forward with, these are the allegations, this was my experience. And as they share that story, I will talk to them about different types of documentation that might be helpful. So, for example, this could include things like text messages with a perpetrator. It could include things like photo evidence of being in a specific place at a specific time, even something like camera roll on your iPhone showing that you were at this location on this day at this time. I've used things like receipts from Ubers. I've used things like emails showing orders that were dated, linking the survivor to show where they were and to help back up the testimony that they are coming forward with to me. So this multimedia and this type of information, it can take lots of different forms, and survivors may or may not always have, a huge range of this information, but it all sort of comes together and falls under these catch-all terms of evidence and documentation.
Thank you so much for such a thorough and just informative answer. Thanks, Kat. Same question to you, Kat Marsh. Kat Marsh, prosecutor. In your purview, what do the words survivor documentation or survivor evidence mean? What comes to mind?
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to piggyback off of the other Kat a little bit. So when I think about documentation evidence, I'm looking for anything that corroborates what the survivor has come forward and related to us. So I hate the expression he said, she said, or he said, or she said, because that's never what we're looking at. There is always evidence to corroborate what the survivor says if we're willing to look for it. And that's what the documentation is. So where other Kat mentioned text messages or photo rolls, those are a lot of what we can look for, Uber records, but we can go to other things. So if people remember the unbelievable story and documentary that was put on it one point, true story, where a victim wasn't believed and was actually prosecuted for a false report. One of the things that was done in that case, law enforcement said the victim wasn't willing to give up her bed sheets where the sexual assault had happened, and therefore must not be telling the truth. Well, if they'd wanted to corroborate why, they would have looked at the evidence that the survivor had been just out of foster care, didn't have money, and buying a new pair of bed sheets would have broken the bank. And the documentation could have been the bank records and the foster records to show this was her first home. And that's easy documentation that could have been done to corroborate that survivor's story. Just like the reverse could have been done if the survivor had gone and bought all new bed sheets. That could have been something to corroborate. So there's so much documentation that's out there that starts with first listening to the survivor of what they can tell us, what they did, what went on in their mind, what went on before and after. And then we just dig through and we find all the different pieces that corroborate that survivor's lived experience.
And that is how it is done. As a survivor who had such abysmal experiences with the local prosecutors assigned to my case, it really does give such hope that there are folks here, like both cats, doing the work that they are doing. So thank you. Next up, we have Lakidra. My screen just disappeared for a second. Zoom. Okay, we're back. Apologies. What does survivor documentation, survivor evidence mean to you?
I mean, I don't even want to go behind the two cats because I'm like, y'all wrote down, like, y'all said everything that I wanted to say. So I'm like, hold on. No, but for me, I am the first person to meet the survivor once an incident has happened. So I go directly to the hospital with the same nurse. And a lot of things we look for in the hospital, I mean, of course, even if there's not evidence as far as like physical that we know of, we still believe the survivor. That's the first thing. But other things we look at is, is there any, I guess, anything on the person's clothes from the incident that happened? Is there bruising? Is there, we'll just say DNA. And also we also talk to the people who were actually there. So witnesses getting their statements, getting their information, and then having police there and just sitting with the survivor, letting them know like, hey, we have, their clothing this happened on. We have text messages, we have all these things. So just understanding, yes, a survivor is not going to have everything, may not have the physical appearance of it, but it has happened. If they said happen, it's happened. And so it's just understanding, taking those pieces together to ensure that when they go to court, that they have everything. So all the evidence, all the DNA testing, everything like that. So they answered it for me. I'm like, I have nothing else to say, but yes.
Well, with all due respect, you're proving yourself wrong because you just added a whole bunch of great things. So thank you for all of that. Next, we have Morgan.
It's so fascinating to hear these different perspectives because everybody is coming in at a different time. And my timeline as a civil lawyer is more often than not, years on, sometimes decades on. And so when I think about documentation, when I think about evidence, and I'm looking at it through the lens of a civil sexual assault claim, which is ultimately, for those who may not be aware, when we claim civilly, we're ultimately claiming for compensation for the harm that was caused by the perpetrator. And this can be a claim against an institution like a school or the military or police or a sporting organization, or it can be an individual perpetrator in an intimate partner relationship or some other circumstance, often a family relationship. So I'm looking at it through that lens, and then I'm looking at two separate tracks. I'm looking at the liability perspective. So that is, can I prove that what the survivor says happened? And how do I prove that? What evidence do I have at my disposal? This is where we often have an overlap with the criminal side of things. And if I have a criminal conviction, that right there is proof. for me. A judge has made a finding or a jury has made a finding that this person committed this act, and then it really ends there. And I move on to the second part of the equation, which is how can I prove the damages? What do I need to bring forth to the court to show that this survivor has been harmed, that it has had an impact on their life, their ability to work, to go to school, to form relationships, to to function in society at the end of the day. And so from that perspective, the documentation and the evidence is often medical and counseling records. It is reports from experts that I might retain. It is contemporaneous reports to, therapists or organizations that work directly with survivors so that they may report at the time to a crisis line or a hotline. So I'm looking at all of that, and we're often having to go back a long ways and balance the interests of the survivor as well. Because, of course, just handing over your counseling records to a bunch of lawyers and to potentially the perpetrator is the last thing that anybody wants in this process. So there's a lot that we have to think about when it comes to what are our obligations of disclosure? What do we need to provide? What is going to be helpful for us? And what does the other side have as well? Often we're working in family dynamics and family relationships. So we're looking at what can the other side bring to the table because they have disclosure obligations as well. And the great part about working in the civil system, at least in Canada, is unlike in our criminal system where the accused does not have to take the stand, does not have to speak in their own defense, in the civil system, we get to subpoena them and they do have to take the stand and they do have to speak. So we're often looking at what can they bring to the table as well.
Thank you. So you got this little smile when you talk about being able to subpoena the other side. That is just like, you see that smile from your lawyer, you know you're in good hands. Thank you for that. That's amazing. Sarah, same question. Survivor documentation, survivor evidence. What does that mean to you? What comes to mind?
Yeah, everyone said pretty much what I wanted to say in a nutshell, but yeah, we always, to me, I think collecting all the details and the information, having as much of that as helpful as possible. When people call or email or they use a VP, video phone, that is definitely hard of hearing people's way of accessing telecommunication services. They call us, they can sign, and there's an interpreter that will interpret everything, and they can see each other on the screen, or they can directly video phone us and see us face to face, so they can explain what has happened, and we can get more information. Really, again, listening to their story is key to gather as much information as possible. Validating their feelings, what had happened, if they need to go take procedural order. Oh, to get a protective order, excuse me. Yeah, if they have a protective order that's active or to get one established, what's happening. So we question them more to get more of that story. In the deaf and hard of hearing community, it's possible, it's a small world. We know each other. What information do they share? So sometimes they only give a few surface details. So we try to get more in-depth information during that intake process so that we can connect them to our advocators, and the advocators can, get more in-depth information. What are their future goals? Help that individual feel more comfortable in connecting with our advocates, getting all the correct information down. Sometimes they're like, oh, I didn't remember this at the moment. I have a text, I have a video. There was a person that was there that saw things happen at the event. Any other data that we can get regarding the situation itself, because trauma does impact your memory. There's a lot that happens. And so you have to, get more information from them, from the advocate side. And also sometimes there's language deprivation. So the advocates will stay with that victim and, hey, tell us a little bit more about what happened, even if they feel reserved. Oftentimes over time they will open up more, so we kind of establish that relationship with them and get more details, anything that would be helpful for their case, We always listen and ask for clarification. Sometimes they'll tell us the story repeatedly and we're like, okay, and we would still listen to them regardless. We want to validate their feelings of what had happened to ensure, to know that they're protected, because the deaf community is small. Sometimes they feel unsure of what information they want to share in the moment, and then they'll feel more comfortable sharing more information later. Also, to importantly, is validate their feelings.
100%, 110%. That listening, the validating supports the survivor and also can help create space for them to feel more comfortable to disclose that information. And such an excellent point about, the impact of trauma in the brain and the whole body, and what it does with the memory. Oftentimes survivors also may not remember, as Sarah said, or they may disclose certain things, kind of get their feet wet to see if it's comfortable, safe, before they share more. Safety is the priority, and we're all trying, all survivors are trying to survive. Thank you all for answering that question. Moving on to the second question, and we'll mix up the order. So this time we're going to reverse that order. So Sarah, you'll be up first panelist wise, and we'll reverse the order. We'll keep it interesting throughout. We have seen a rise of media content and reporting on survivor experiences. Yay! Unfortunately, this has also come with a rise of misinformation on this subject matter. What myths or narratives about survivor evidence, survivor experiences do you want to squash or dispel? Sarah?
What comes to mind for me? It's important to validate that there is a system, or that sometimes systems have errors. Survivors, we want to let them know that it is not on you, that there's a system and what's happening in the context, and to make sure that the information is correct, or to make sure that there's not misinformation being shared. Like, for example, in court, for deaf and hard of hearing people, profoundly deaf or deaf-blind people, sometimes it's frustrating with the language access. There's not enough resources or information out there. There's not enough access to resources where the information is presented in their native language, ASL. And then trauma can also cause that to be, worsen. So really working with them and validating the system and where they're getting the information. But sometimes that can be very challenging. And, especially people who've experienced sexual violence, domestic violence, dating violence, etc. So it's good to recognize that sometimes there's no physical evidence too. Sometimes they don't have recordings or anything to document, and they're like, no, this really happened. And you validate that experience and be able to gather that information to bring it up into court. And it does take time to recognize their experiences and gather that documentation. And we want to break down those barriers for them from the system and accommodate the survivors from their experience and their harm, especially if the person has language deprivation, or, as I mentioned, the deaf community is small. Sometimes they experience double the trauma, especially with the language barrier in court. Sometimes the court systems, what if they don't provide an interpreter, or their court date keeps getting rescheduled? It increases that stress, that trauma that individual is experiencing. Oftentimes, the interpretation of information, they don't get the full access to that. So there is a lot of barriers just within the system itself.
That there is, and we actually are going to dive into that a bit more. So thank you for touching on that and for bringing that up. Next up, we have Morgan. What myths, narratives about, misinformation do you want to dispel?
Well, jumping off of Sarah's remarks, I think a lot of people will come to me and talk about their disappointment with the criminal process, either because they were afraid to report it to the police for a variety of reasons, or reported it to the police and weren't taken seriously or weren't listened to, or the police investigated and then ultimately we have the Crown in Canada. The Crown declined to press charges. And so they come disappointed with their experience in that process, or even if a conviction was secured, they're still disappointed with that process because of what it took to get there. And they're looking for justice. And what I will often have to say to people is that there is no justice here in this system. What we can do is we can try to get you some accountability. We can try to get you compensation, but that's what the legal system can do. And it's so limited and it's so restrictive in what it can do, because even that process, even the civil process, although we have so much more power and control in terms of guiding it and directing it and not being sort of sidelined as you would be in the criminal process, you ultimately are still subject to the legal system. And the legal system, as Sarah touched on, does not take into account so many things. And often the result can be more harm than good coming out of it. So that's something for people to be aware. And then in terms of other myths, I think one of the problems that I have with a lot of the reporting that is done in this area is that there's a focus still on some of the, and I don't like this term, but I will use it, on some of the rape myths that have been debunked, and that in Canada, our Supreme Court has said you cannot rely on these. You cannot rely on a person saying that they will consent to having sex with one person for them then being assaulted by five other people, or consuming alcohol and all of these things. I mean, it's the old "what was she wearing," right? I don't know if the Hockey Canada case is making any way down in the States, but up here, there's a significant criminal decision going on right now. It's been a case, there were 2 juries, there were mistrials. It's now before a judge alone. And the issue has been whether the survivor was assaulted by a number of hockey players in a hotel room. And the cross-examination of that survivor focused so heavily on text messages that she sent afterwards, on what she was wearing that night, on the fact that she did have consensual sex with one of the individuals. And so the proliferation of rape myths in the reporting of that story has, I think, a significant deterrent effect for a lot of other survivors. So that's one thing that I would like to see corrected, frankly, in a lot of the media, is pointing out that although that may be a focus of cross-examination, that ultimately has very little weight on the decision that is made.
That is so, so important to acknowledge. Thank you. And that trial has made it a bit over here.
A little bit, just like a little bit. They're like, what's happening up there?
Hopefully a little bit, taking break from all of our other, breaking headlines. Next up, we have Lakidra. Same question, myths or narratives about survivor evidence, survivor experience. Do you want to dismantle?
Yeah, so the biggest thing is if they don't report, it didn't happen. That's what I hear all on social media. I'm like, are you serious? Or if they didn't report at a certain time that it didn't happen. So people have to realize that, again, as Sarah mentioned earlier, survivors, when you're in that mind, you're in fight or flight. You don't know when to report, or you're re-traumatized, or you're going through so much emotionally. So when people say you have to report a certain amount of time, that's no. The survivor, when they're ready to report, allow them to, give them a safe place and space to report. And so we have to make sure we don't take their voice away, and allow them to do that. Another thing, I definitely see this a lot in the military, because in the military, being in the military, and having clients there, we aren't able to report in a certain amount of time due to the chain of command, or maybe the person who did it is in your chain of command, and so you don't want to say anything because of fear of repercussions. And so there are times we do have to wait for our own safety. There's a report, I don't 2020, with Vanessa Guillen. So sexual harassment happened and then she ended up dead. So it's a lot of things that happen amongst a lot of military women, non-military women. When they do say something, they're in fear of their life. So just understand, if a person doesn't report in a certain amount of time, it's okay. It does not mean it didn't happen.
yes, that to 1,000 and zillion percent. And especially when it is, as everyone's touched on, it isn't safe. There are so many unique challenges. I think a lot about how many survivors share that them trying to seek justice, navigating these different various systems are more traumatic than the initial incidents, and that just speaks just speaks volumes of just the different challenges, the safety aspects that come with that. Next up, Cat 10 Barge.
Yeah, so these have all been incredible responses. And a lot of what my work has focused on in recent years is looking at how, when allegations and when survivors' lived experiences are communicated to the public, what sort of response are they getting, and how does that reinforce certain biases and myths? And so I feel like when it comes to evidence and documentation, it's like a catch-22. If the public feels that a survivor doesn't have enough evidence or documentation, they will often use denial tactics to try and undermine the credibility of the survivor. But on the other hand, and I've seen this in recent reporting, when you see examples of documentation and evidence, things like photos. There was a recent story. It was the reported allegations against the author Neil Gaiman, and the survivor had taken photographs of themselves after, these alleged assaults. And I saw a lot of people on social media question, why would they take these photos? Like, they felt that it was weird, or they felt it was off-putting that these photos existed. But if they didn't, that the exact same people would say, where's the evidence? So in a lot of cases, you will have like situations where it feels like survivors can't win. And I've also seen that even happen internally within newsrooms, where not everyone involved in the editorial process, not every editor, not every executive is informed. And quite frankly, more often than not, these people are not receiving training. They're not necessarily survivor, victim informed, or trauma informed. So you see a lot of victim blaming and shaming sort of rhetoric emerge. And the last thing I wanted to mention is I've covered several cases over the past few years where perpetrators will attempt to reframe documentation using DARVO. So for those who aren't familiar, DARVO refers to deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. And it's a common way that perpetrators will respond to attempts to hold them accountable. So one example that I reported on was a survivor named Sam, whose ex-husband, her perpetrator, filmed videos of her reacting to his abuse. And in these videos, which he disseminated on social media, and they went incredibly viral, she was reacting very emotionally. She was, reacting with she was like on the floor yelling and screaming. And people online took this that she was actually the perpetrator in this situation. They weren't trauma informed. They weren't survivor informed. They didn't realize that this was actually documentation of the abuse that she had suffered. And so that's a perception that I have tried, in my reporting to correct, but it's clear that there's a lot of widespread unawareness of things like DARVO, and also how survivors most commonly react in abusive situations.
Absolutely. And that's why trauma survivor informed care, professionals, supporters, it's so important to be able to help provide, explanation and, the framing. Next up, Kat Marsh, same question to you.
Well, I don't want to repeat what everybody else has already said, but I will say, as a prosecutor of criminal cases, if there's one thing that I wish jurors understood the most, is that there isn't an expected or typical survivor experience. And the thought that a survivor needs to be curled up in a ball in their room after an abusive situation, and that's the only proper way to respond, or that they're not supposed to smile again, or go out with friends, or socialize, or if they do that close in time to the abusive situation, that it must not be a real abusive situation. It's just a huge fallacy. So If I could get all jurors to understand that there is no typical way to react to trauma, that everybody gets to react in the way that works for them, and it is a real and genuine response, that would, one, make my job a lot easier. Two, it would make a survivor's job on the stand a lot easier, and it would help overall in dispelling rape myths. I think getting a better understanding of trauma in general in the community would be great. What was it, 3 weeks ago, I think, with the beginning of the Sean Diddy Combs trial, I remember sitting in my office listening to Bill Maher say, after the Me Too movement, I think we can all agree if you don't leave the first time after a situation, it's now consent. And just wanting to scream and be like, here's somebody who's reporting to be in a journalistic situation and making this statement to the community at large that after Me Too, there's no excuse to stay in an abusive situation anymore. And it's just showing you don't understand the dynamics and how that's harming all survivors by putting that narrative out to the public. So I think anytime we can share with the public, there's no one way to respond to trauma, that all trauma responses are normal. And then those of us who are in the court system, putting on experts to explain trauma responses to help educate, I think can make it a better experience for survivors.
Yes to that mission. I mean, it really is so harmful. And those are a lot of the things that we see every day. As soon as you fire up social media, you log on, and just that uninformed, harmful rhetoric. Um, I've said it before and I'll say it again, it's a public health crisis. It impacts survivors, it impacts communities. Nobody plans on being a survivor. We all do what we need to do to survive. We got some comments. Thank you everyone for the comments and utilizing the chat. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop those in. Someone said differentiation. I can't say that word. Differentiation between dominant oppressor versus a response in reaction to an abuse. Such important education. Yes. Great example of how DARVO is used. Yes. It's not as easy as just reporting. Excellent. The victim can't win. Victim blaming culture has been feeling really heavy. Yes. And the thing is that people and enablers, they're always going to move a goalpost if they need to. They'll weaponize, anything that they can, including these systems. Let's talk about the practicality of survivors collecting documentation and evidence. Let's be real. First off, safety is the priority, and it's not always safe or even possible, especially when you're trying to survive. Your first thought is not necessarily, let me try to record, document this. If we have time, we may have time to talk about how in some states it's even criminalized. In Pennsylvania, if you think that you're about to be assaulted and you record it, that's considered tampering with evidence. There's some messed up laws. Yeah. So with that said, safety is the priority. And also one other thing I wanted to note on some of these cases, sometimes you're a child. And again, all we can do is try to survive at any age. Sometimes we don't know it's abuse while it's happening until later on. With that said, what would you tell a victim that's not able to do any record keeping? And secondly, what are some ways that for victims who may be able to or interested in documenting, how can they more safely document their experiences? Lakedra, you want to start us off with this one?
Oh, I knew you was coming for me because you looked at me. I was like,
I wanted you to be able to go first this time.
you know what? Honestly, my youngest client has been 18 months. So documentation in that incident was so hard. But the evidence was there, right? The evidence was 100% there. So when they can't, I mean, what I tell, like I told the parent, I tell everybody else, regardless, it happened. You said it happened, regardless of evidence to have anything. If you said it happened, it happened. And you may not have the evidence. Sometimes, I mean, I've had survivors that lost their phone, or don't have all the information. So, hey, if you don't have it, it's okay. We believe you, and we're gonna sit here and walk with you through this thing. And then the ones that want to talk about documenting later, or maybe had I guess, had been roofied or something. What I tell them, as things start coming into your head, just write them down. But also do not contact the people that were there with you, because if you go somewhere, go report to the police and say, hey, this person sexually assaulted me. And then you call that person and say, hey, I'm talking to the police about you. Guess what's going to happen? Retaliation. So also tell them, when you document, don't reach out to them and say, hey, what did you do this to me or whatever? Just try to talk to the people that were there, get the police involved, of course, but write down as much as you can as possible. And if you don't remember, it's okay. It's the mindset of survivor. Sometimes you don't remember everything, but try to as much as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you. And survivors are evidence. They are the evidence. And I think oftentimes court, society, etc., is too quick to forget that the survivors themselves are evidence. Thank you for that. Next up, Morgan, let's talk safety.
Yeah, so jumping off of that, I mean, again, I'm often coming on many years later, and what I'm looking at is indicia that this person was trying to reach out. And so often in children, what we see is maybe they made a comment to a school teacher or a counselor, and was that documented? Was, the Ministry of Children and Families called to investigate at that point what was done to look after this person's safety? But more often than not, they're not reporting because they're not in a safe place. Maybe they're in a foster situation. Maybe the abuse is coming from both parents. There's no one that they can trust to talk to. And so again, you're starting from that proposition of, I believe you. Your evidence is the evidence. If that is the only evidence that we have, then that is still enough to mount a successful civil sexual assault claim. And it will come down to credibility and reliability, and we can work on that. But your evidence is the evidence, and that's the most important piece. The other piece that we will look at is, did they tell family and friends? Was there a comment made to a friend at schools? Anything about being uncomfortable, not wanting to go home? Because we can talk to those people. And in Canada, the fact that you said it doesn't necessarily, it's not accepted by the courts as true, but it's accepted for the fact that you said it. And if we can say, well, what other motivation would a 12-year-old have for telling her friend that she didn't want to go home because she was being abused? And so the fact that that was said, we can use that 10 years later to help build that claim. So there are lots of little things that, that's my job. That's not the survivor's job to think about, but that's my job, is to think about what kinds of things that can we use as evidence. Because let's face it, I mean, the survivors rightfully, when they're in it and they're in trauma, they're not thinking about what can be used as evidence. So, that's Kat's challenge, both of them, and mine later on, is to help figure out what we can bring before the courts or the court of a public opinion to try to prove this case.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I just appreciate just the compassionate, informed responses, and just the central theme of start by believing. I'm a victim advocate, and I often get asked, well, maybe not often, but I occasionally get asked, is it hard to believe the folks that you work with? And first off, yes, it's like the easiest part of the work, but also it's not my role to decide if somebody is being truthful or not. It's my job to come in there believing them, support them, help inform them of what their resources, options may be. Start by believing. I see a comment. Sarah will be next. Let's see. I see a comment. It's so nice to be in a space where I don't feel crazy, validating that the survivor is evidence. Thank you for being here, for saying that. I see a question that we will try to get to. I want to answer all the safety planning questions first, but I see your question about the whistleblower. Back to safety planning. Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you for making that comment. And this is always something that I do say to survivors, depending on how they share their story, how they share it, they document. I let them know that they're not alone, and that, again, maybe we can document things later as they remember, and then to recognize that and allow them to, privately potentially share, recorded conversations or things of that sort. So sometimes I have them show me things like from a hidden camera perspective, and we can use that in court. But I do let them know that we can't use those because it is illegal to have, private or unknown recording of oneself or another person, or if there's another way that we can use any type of evidence, potentially text messages, witnesses. I try to explain that to them. And, if things are happening at home, if there's another way to use things for evidence, so we can figure out what is the best way that we can provide support for them. And then also to remind them that they're not alone. We're here. We will document everything, that we can, so that we can bring it to court or help them with obtaining a protective order. Sometimes they're like, oh, I can't use this, or why, and they get frustrated. So I do have to, calm them down and remind them, that we're here for you. We believe you. I see you. Your experience is valid, and I support them throughout the entire process. We're not going to judge them. We're not going to deny or turn them down. We're here to support them until the end. It is challenging, especially if things come up legally. Some things can be pretty frustrating of what you can and can't use as evidence in court. So
Yeah, I think frustrating is an understatement. And I think that's also such an important point that, we have folks here from the States all over, from Canada, that jurisdiction is going to, it depends. Some states have one-party consent laws. Some states may have two-party consent laws, meaning the difference between legally recording a conversation, etc. So thank you for that. Next up, Kat Tenbars, followed by Kat Marsh.
Yes. So when it comes to survivor evidence and safety, in my experience, a lot of survivors, because of all of these myths and stigmas around what evidence counts and what evidence is, survivors may or may not know that certain things that they have at their disposal may count as corroboration or evidence. And in that process, it's so important to build a sense of trust and safety, and that takes time. So building that relationship between reporter and source is really important, and it does start from a place of believing. And as I'm sure many of us know, there's been so much research, both for like law enforcement and for people in roles outside of law enforcement in working with survivors, where by starting from that position of believing, it's really the only way that you can get the best sense of the situation and the way that you can get as much evidence and documentation as possible. One thing I also think about is when a survivor is still actively in contact with a perpetrator. So whether they may be still in an ongoing relationship with a perpetrator, they may still be living with this person, or this person might still have access to their devices. A lot of times, as we've discussed, there may be information stored in text messages, in conversations with friends on apps like Snapchat or other social media platforms. If the perpetrator has access to a passcode, or if they make the victim share their passcode with them, then that information may not be able to be safely collected. There are apps that are designed to look like something else that can have a different passcode. So like there's an app that's designed to look like a calculator, but it's actually a place where you can store notes and multimedia, and it can have a separate passcode. So I've talked to survivors about these types of things. But even that, obviously, the most important thing is remaining safe in that situation. So I also always tell survivors, like, the amount of detailed evidence or documentation that you have, it's not reflective of your credibility. It's not reflective of whether or not these things happened. Oftentimes, it's just reflective of your circumstances. And that's really important in building that trusting relationship.
Absolutely. And thank you for talking about that technological piece. When working with victims, it's really important. What is a safe way for me to contact you? Or is your email safe, phone number? Because one may be monitored, etc. Checking those points of contact, super, super important. Kat Marsh?
I echo everything that has been said. I think the most important thing to stress is safety first. And I think all survivors need to understand that they should prioritize their safety. And if their safety is they're in a relationship with the abuser, and so it's not, I can't make a report, then surviving is the most important part, right? If their mental health is, I want to go get medical treatment, but my mental health is not in a place that I can report this to law enforcement, then their mental health is what controls, right? And I think that is what everybody needs to be on the same page about first. If I could have every survivor go to the hospital first to get medical treatment, even if they never reported to law enforcement, but I knew they got medical treatment that they needed, then I would be fine with that. And if I don't have a job, then I don't have a job. I know my survivors have the medical treatment that they need. But if they change their mind and they want to report later, then there's evidence because they got medical treatment, right? So safety first. I also think when we look at cases, and speaking on the law enforcement side, there's ways we can look at it depending on whether it's a fresh or a historic case when it comes to us. If it's a fresh case, yes, the victim is always evidence. Their story is the documentation. As awful as it is, their body is a crime scene, but so is the perpetrators. And if they can come to and they can report it within a week, then I'm getting a search warrant and I'm bringing in the perpetrator to get a safe, sane exam at the hospital too. Because if I can get evidence off my victim, I can get evidence off my perpetrator. And so there's different ways we can look at that if it's a fresh case. If it's a historic case, and it is perfectly fine for it to be a historic case, then we just go back and we look at the ways we can corroborate historically. Maybe it's showing that the house that it happened in when they were a child, that house, the floor plan matched the victim's memory from when they were 7. And I can find floor plans. I can find somebody who may have a picture that shows the paint color on the wall from 15 years ago. So safety first, their story is the evidence. And if they can trust us with their story and we can take the time to do the work, we will find the evidence we need to corroborate their story.
Powerful words, powerful words. I don't know if you remember this, Kat, but years ago, you told me, and it stuck with me. Like, I think about this almost every day, especially in the work that, we were talking about how brave survivors are. And I was crying about the systems and how the latest way they had failed me and as a survivor. And Kat said, survivors are brave. We need other people to be brave with them. And I think that's one of the truest things I've ever heard. All the people that we're hearing from today, prosecutors, lawyers, advocates, folks who are working with the community, you all are showing up and saying, we will find this. And I think for survivors, there's probably can be a little bit of grief and sadness in that if you did not have that experience. I think it can also give a lot of hope that this can be the norm, that there are professionals who do care, who are, looking at, who do think that safety is the priority, because that should not be like a hot take at all. Okay, this conversation is going by so fast. Thank you all for being here. Next question. Deaf survivors, survivors of color, queer survivors, disabled survivors, other marginalized survivors face additional challenges when it comes to documentation and evidence. For example, not having access to support and resources, being misrepresented due to access barriers, the use of harmful racialized language by providers or reporters who are creating this documentation. We've spoken a little bit about some of these challenges. So wanted to ask folks, can you share an example of challenges that you've observed or elaborate on one? And how do you recommend survivors and professionals navigate that obstacle? For time, I'm kind of going to wrap in the next question because I think it goes hand in hand, acknowledging that folks who work with survivors, such as advocates, therapists, lawyers, prosecutors, reporters, etc., are in a unique position of power in regards to documenting the survivor's lived experiences and or reviewing that documentation, looking through it with care, making sure that it's being interpreted, properly. So part of that, kind of merging these questions, looking at these challenges, how can you recommend survivors and professionals navigate, and also honor, acknowledge, use that privilege to support all survivors. Sarah, you want to start us off with this one?
Yeah, sure. So just to my previous question, I can add on more to this and make it more concise. But here at Dawn, we're always asking specific questions because in the deaf community, we're very small. So it means we need to ask names and the person who caused harm and perhaps collect some information from about the person who caused harm. They may call us and ask us about services, and we would have to refer them to specifically what it is that they're asking for. So really to protect our survivors and not to move forward thinking that everything is okay, but have control in observing and filtering out the information to document and protect those survivors for their specific needs and services. And navigating those challenges, what I notice throughout that documentation process, something that comes up often in a situation that I've noticed is that it's possible for somebody to do a fake call and say, hey, I saw this specific person in this specific circumstance, and this person caused this kind of harm, and they're not supposed to. And I'm having to really work and filter through that. Now, are you covering up for somebody, or are you the actual person making this report? So we're having to work through that because they're acting as if though they know that individual, but we're having to protect the survivor and not misinterpret any kind of information and really cause harm to their case. So we have to make sure that there is accurate information, that there's numbers, any type of documentation, their location, where the incident took place. We'll document that. And then, of course, we won't disclose any of the survivor's name or anything that's considered confidential. We'll just gather what we can and then do our investigation. And we'll ask the community within our work to confirm that this information is true. And we'll be able to identify if this person is trying to retaliate or not. And we can report the person who's causing harm. So again, it could be somebody just acting as somebody else. I've noticed that happen from time to time. There's also in situations where information has been misinterpreted and causes harm to their case. And even at a smaller scale, because it is within the deaf community, people are hesitant and emotional about this process. Also, specifically with another question that was asked, we do a recovery assessment, so there will be a number of questions that we ask. We'll ask who it is that they want to work with. We want to learn more about their story, what's happened in the past, how they've been impacted now, and how to really better their future. Those are the types of recordings that we make and that we try to work with them. We're not just trying to just put it in record, but we're working with the survivor to make sure that their story is validated, that they feel seen, and that it doesn't happen again. Because sometimes what the deaf community can do is just spread news, spread gossip. It could be as simple as something that happened in DC and someone caught wind of it in California. And so it's no joke. I'm telling you, it's a very small community, and we often recognize what's happening, and there's this sense of gossip that goes around. So knowing the person, the place, having someone that they trust in order to document, that they feel safe enough to share their story, but really protecting them and providing them the tools and advocating them. I'm an advocate, and every day I'm both internal and external, having to provide these tools, specific terminologies that they may need to know, maybe specific communities that they need to be at where they might feel more safe, or just certain things that would then make them feel safe and protected. And so those are the kind of things that happen. Now with Dawn, I do work as an advocate, and I'm having to try to record as many specifics as possible because then again, I've reiterated it, but the deaf community is very small. It's true.
Well, I appreciate for you being here and being able to, share those, unique challenges and expertise. The community is lucky to have you. Lakidra?
Thank you.
Trying to unmute. Oh my gosh. So, wow. Sarah, hey, she explained it so well. But what I will say is I deal with all survivors, any disabled, anything. And my first survivor was a deaf survivor. And I think the issue that I had in that moment is that we weren't able to get an interpreter right away. And so instead of the survivor getting help, she went ahead and left. But the interesting part was that the police officer who was there was saying, "Is she dumb? Does she not understand what I'm saying?" And that right there, that made me want to throw my shoe at him. Also having kids with, can't speak, that have autism, that are unable to talk. I'm dealing with that too. So just hearing when the kids are frustrated, how the cops respond to them, or the nurses who are there, like, oh, they're angry, maybe this didn't happen, or maybe the family member doesn't believe them because they can't understand them. So the biggest thing I try to do was ensure, maybe if the family member is triggering them, then I need to get a social worker in, or somebody else who can understand the child. And then when it comes to someone who can't hear, making sure that I have an interpreter there, and the police or whoever's there understand, like, hey, you may not understand what they're saying, but believe them. They're not going to lie to you. And so that's the biggest thing. And then the second part, what was the second part you said? The question.
Yes, so was what is the second part? Checking my notes. How can,
Support.
advocates, providers, etc., use their power and privilege to better
Yeah.
support survivors?
Yeah. So what I always start is, what are you comfortable with sharing? And when I ask their story, I want to make sure that they have full control on what I know and what they want to say. I'm not going to make them add anything to the description or anything. I will ask them as I'm writing everything down, okay, let me repeat this back to you. Are you okay with this? So the biggest thing is letting the survivor have control of their narrative, and understanding that, hey, we're here to document what you want, and we're going to be beside you through the whole process. So that's basically all I have on that one.
No, absolutely. Consent is ongoing throughout the entire process. It's not, okay, we've initially started talking, we've checked things off. It's, continuing that continuous check-in. How can we make them comfortable? What access needs, etc. Kat Tenbarge.
Yes. So I wanted to talk about some experiences that I've had reporting with queer survivors and trans survivors specifically, because pronouns and the way that someone's gender identity is reflected contemporaneously versus historically can be a challenge. So I've worked with survivors who are both trans and non-binary, but at the time of the assault or the abuse, they identified in a different way and used different pronouns. And so this factors into both the reporting process and then also the writing process. In the reporting process, it's really important for me to establish with the source, with the survivor. Obviously, what pronouns they are currently comfortable using, but also how they feel about discussing documentation where they're being referred to differently, and clarifying with them, how can I do this in a way that is most comfortable for you? How can I do this in a way that is not re-traumatizing for you? And oftentimes that can be really important because it adds another layer to what they're already experiencing, just going back to and reliving and retelling this story. So that's really important in the reporting process. And then in the writing process, it's also really important to clarify to the reader sort of what is going on here. And so you can use language throughout your piece, whether it's a written piece or whether it's a piece that's told through multimedia and video. It is so crucial to always make sure that the reader or the viewer is knowing how the survivor identifies now and why we have to sometimes include, like if we're choosing to include text messages or something like that, where different pronouns are being used, making that clear, and also ensuring that there is respect being communicated throughout all of this, that someone's identity is never being invalidated. And oftentimes I'll use language where if I am interviewing or writing about a non-binary survivor, for example, I'll clarify upon the very first mention, like this person is non-binary, which means they use they, them pronouns. And throughout the piece, since that can sometimes be confusing to the reader when you use the they pronoun, sometimes it's better to use a last name if the person is on the record, or if the person is anonymous, it can be really helpful to use like a letter. So like if I'm speaking to an anonymous non-binary source in the piece, I might refer to them as just like a letter like M. And so that way the reader knows who we're referring to, but we're making sure that we never jeopardize the correct and proper pronouns for someone's preference.
I love this. I love this. I mean, honestly, you all are changing the world, truly. Thank you. Morgan and then Kat Marsh. Also, if anybody has any questions, put them in the chat. We'll do some participant questions.
So I've got a few examples, just taking it from my experience. I think in Canada, we have had centuries of institutional racism and institutional bias. And so that's something that I encounter frequently, especially with historical cases, and especially when I'm working with our Indigenous populations. So for example, a way that you can see it in practice is in Canada, Indigenous women represent over half of our incarcerated population, while they represent less than 5% of our actual population. So the statistics are staggering, and you can see it when you pull records for historical claims, whether they are residential school records, Catholic Church records, social work records, police records. The institutional bias and racism is running throughout. And so frequently what the survivor says is discounted, is not taken seriously, is chalked up to them being drunk or stupid or whatever it may be. And so that's a real challenge that we have, because we've got these records that, often show that an individual was maybe trying to come forward and nothing was done. And there are really damaging comments about the individual within those records, or it could be something like trying to use a criminal record against somebody. And so you have to provide that context of, how did they get on that path? Would they have been on that path if not for the abuse that they suffered as a child in this institution? So there's a lot of contextualizing that has to happen. There's a lot of awareness that has to happen. And a lot of what we can do is pointing out where there is that institutional bias, that there is that institutional racism, and the work that we do will hopefully work towards systemic change. I think that's probably a separate conversation that needs to have many more hours devoted to it. But that's a piece that we see quite often. And so what can we do? Well, we can call it out when we see it, I think is a really important piece. And just be aware that when you're looking at these records, there are these biases. And so trying to understand that and not taking things at face value is so crucial, and being ready to confront that when defense counsel attempts to use it against you or your client.
Yes, Morgan on the spot. You definitely would want you in charge of, survivors' cases. And Morgan is please correct me if I get this wrong, but one of the founding creators, members of this new organization in Canada, sexual assault. What's the LA?
Lawyers Alliance. Yes. Yeah. So we're a group of lawyers who do this, and we were like, we're having these informal conversations anyway. Let's put an organization together and we can actually start like having a bigger voice, making some change, because we're all seeing the same things all across the country. So we may as well speak about it.
Well, thank you for that. Kat Marsh.
Well, I think the first thing is recognizing that we are woefully unprepared for some disabilities in the law enforcement community, especially in more rural jurisdictions. And survivors need to know that there is nothing wrong with them asking to have a community advocate come with them for interviews, to insist that they're going to have a community advocate come with them. Oftentimes, our community advocacy organizations are better prepared to meet disabilities than law enforcement communities might be. And so, if we have the advocates come with the survivors, that can help make the interview process a lot easier for everyone involved. They may have the proper technology to assist in a disabled interview that the law enforcement department may not have. Having a community advocate who deals with specific differences in the community that a very small rural community is not used to dealing with can help almost bridge the gap in the communication between the survivor and the law enforcement personnel. So survivors have that right to have an advocate, and I just want to make sure they know that, and there's nothing wrong with them bringing their community advocate with them for those interviews. And then I think the same thing is prosecutors need to have the conversations with survivors. What are your concerns? What are you worried about coming up in court? What do you think might be used against you? What do you think the biases might be? Because we have tools. We can file motions in advance of court for things not to be able to be brought up. We should be using the voir dire process, which is where we question potential jurors who are going to sit on the case to find out about potential biases. And so if we can have our conversations with our survivors in advance, find out what some of those concerns might be so we can do the proper tools, get our weapons in advance to make sure we're armed for the court process to better support our survivors, that's a really strong way for us to go into court. And then I think on the law enforcement side, we always have to be willing to learn. And we also always have to be willing to be corrected and understand that when we are corrected, we are meeting that correction with grace and not with defensiveness. And I think if we can meet that where our survivor is and with what they're willing to teach us, where they're willing to correct us where we're wrong, we can really build a strong case together.
Absolutely, absolutely. As folks have chimed in here, that's so refreshing to hear. And absolutely, survivors are evidence. They're also the experts. And that is the foundation of survivor informed care. And I think all too often that is dismissed in these spaces. So thank you all for being folks who do acknowledge that and acknowledge the privilege and the disparities, etc. I actually got recently I put a thing up on social media about guidelines for collaborations, sharing on social media. And I had made a comment how I try not to add to more content resources that does not have at the bare minimum alt text, captions, etc. And someone who wanted to collaborate with me was like, is it that big of a deal? And it's like, yes, it is that deep, especially when there already are such fewer resources, and the more accessible, that acknowledges, the plights of many different survivors, like that is that deep. It is that important. And all of you have done such a wonderful job expressing that. Time-wise, we're not going to be able to get to all of our set questions. This has been such a great conversation. participants, if you do have any questions, throw them in the chat. I'm scrolling back up, so I know somebody asked, and if you can clarify, so it says, what if you reported via whistleblower, but it's a client, so you cannot be used under NDA? I'm not sure what you mean by client, but Morgan or Kat Marsh, do either of you want to, or both of you want to take that one as far as reporting and whistleblowers and their testimonies?
I don't know that I have anything to add on reporting on whistleblowers. It's not something I've come across, so I would be interested if anybody does have anything to add. In terms of the NDA piece, I would say that if somebody has signed an NDA, then we're always going to look at what were the circumstances of signing that NDA, and is there any way that around that at this point? Is there an expiry date? Was there an inequity in bargaining position? Like, were they coerced or forced to sign that NDA? What are the specific provisions of that NDA? So I think there's a lot of attention on NDAs right now. In Canada, we're having a bit of legislative reform to see if we can do away with NDAs in cases involving sexual violence, especially in employment circumstances and other circumstances. So if that happens, that would be a huge leap forward. But NDAs are often not as powerful as people think they are, especially now that there is so much more awareness about the bargaining positions. So I'll leave it there. I can't speak to the whistleblower piece though.
No problem. That was very informative. Thank you. Kat Marsh, any thoughts?
Really, only the NDA is really going to bar more on the civil side. It's never going to bar on the criminal side. And so if somebody had signed an NDA, but a crime was committed and they want to report the crime, the NDA does not stop the report of the crime. They get to go forward. They get to report that crime. They get to have that investigated. There is nothing that will bar that. And so don't let anybody think that the NDA bars the reporting of a criminal action.
Super, super important. Thank you. Kat Tenbarge, any thoughts from a reporting standpoint?
Yes. So in the reporting process involving both whistleblowers and NDAs, it can sometimes be helpful because journalists have certain protections around both whistleblowers and being able to report on the subject of NDAs. However, I will also note that it really functions on a case-by-case basis. And one thing to always keep in mind, and one thing that it's the reporter's responsibility to keep in mind, is disclosing information that could only sort of be about like one specific person, because even if we as reporters are protected, we always want to make sure that we are doing everything in our power to protect our anonymous sources or our sources who are sort of locked into these kinds of things from retaliation. And so with that being said, I would just say that there are protections for us in terms of we are allowed to not have to disclose our sources. And so there is legal precedent there. And so that can be very helpful for survivors, but also to keep in mind that there have been lots of cases where perpetrators or institutions have been able to sort of reverse engineer and figure out like who leaked specific information if it's something that is that specific. And so that kind of goes back to the question about safety as well, because it's always very important to keep in mind, like in disclosing information to the public, how are we opening up a vulnerability for our source?
Appreciate that. Thank you. And I see that Lakedra commented, I've seen NDAs with professional athletes and survivors. Yeah. NDAs should, I think we may need to have a whole other panel on NDAs because I have a lot to say on that too. And based on everyone's faces and expressions, I think they agree. We are about at the end, so want to wind things down. Thank you all for being here, for showing up. Being here is just an extra way that you are supporting survivors. I hope that you can take this information and bring it back to your communities. Thank you to all of our amazing panelists. I am just in awe of the work that you're doing and how well you're able to share that with us. Typically folks ask, is there going to be a recording of this? We have recorded this. My process is then I typically take a couple of days to download it, get it off to the panelists to sign off on, and then I will share to YouTube and make sure that you all have that. Reminder that you matter. Safety is the priority, and there is no right way to be a survivor. It's really tough. I know sometimes it can feel like you're doing it wrong. It's just really tough is what it is. It doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. You make sense. Reach out if I can support you in any way. Reach out to Dawn if they can support you in any way. I know the panelists left their information in the chat. Go follow them, support their work. Let's see. Is there any way to submit an anonymous question after the Zoom? And thank you. Yes, if you feel comfortable, you can email me, respond to the email if you got the link. I don't know if you're able to, but you can also try to direct message me here, and I won't, but you can always email me and I will do my best to follow up with you. Thank you for feeling comfortable enough to ask about that. If anybody has any additional questions, thoughts, etc., after we end the Zoom, don't hesitate to reach out. Reminder that this is a fundraiser. If you've not already and you are able to, please donate to Dawn to help continue the amazing work they are doing. I'm going to try to talk and type at the same time, which is actually pretty dangerous. I'm like the world's worst typer. Like, it's so like awful. Okay. Donate, support survivors. Let's take a moment. We talked about some serious stuff. Let's shake it out again. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You matter, and talk to y'all soon.